My name is Tim Barker. I'm District Attorney for York County. And we thank you all for being here today. As you can see with all of the dignitaries that are behind me and surrounding me from our different departments, going from right to left, we have, of course, our President Commissioner, Julie Wheeler. We have our Police Commissioner for the City of York, Michael Muldrow. We have Trooper Grothy with the Pennsylvania State Police and their Communications Unit. We have Chief John Snyder from the West Manchester Township Police Department. We have from West York Borough Police Department both Chief Matthew Millsaps and Lieutenant Dave Cayley. We also have Chief Dave Lash from the Northern York County Regional Police Department. We also have Chief Todd King from Springettsbury Township Police Department. We have our Sheriff Richard Kuliber, as well as his top assistant Steve Deal. We also have from our coroner's office our coroner Pam Gay, as well as her chief assistant as well, Tanya Zek. And we're here today for a specific reason. Back on February 22nd, when we spoke to you after what occurred at UPMC Memorial Hospital, we stated that there was going to be a full criminal investigation that was going to occur, and that when that was concluded, we would come forward and we would speak to all of you about some additional findings of fact. During this time period, as you know from contacting our office, we have continuously refused to say anything until the time that the investigation had hit a point where we could say it had essentially reached its conclusion. And that was intentional. That was intentional because we knew if we'd be coming back out here, we would need to be offering a true finding of fact. And I want to state at the outset, these findings ultimately had to be made by me. I am so greatly appreciative to all of law enforcement, but especially in this particular instance with this investigation, the Pennsylvania State Police, with the assistance of our county detectives. They thoroughly investigated this matter and allow me to feel that I'm able to offer to you a true conclusion and some answers to what have been pressing questions. I thank all of law enforcement for all of their cooperation. At a time when everyone was trying to heal, we had to go in and ask questions. And we had to go ahead and see what answers could be provided. We know by doing that we ran the risk of offering further trauma to occur to all of the officers that we care about so much, all of the healthcare workers that we care about so much. We love them dearly and deeply, and we appreciate their cooperation. I want to also specifically thank an unnoticed and behind-the-scenes individual, but Edward Paskey, counsel for the FOP, the work that he has done in working with our Fraternal Order of Police and with all police agencies, the great work that he has done to make sure that everyone is able to go ahead and receive care and talk with people and to work their way through it. It's unsung work of true care and love that we thank you very much, Ed Paskey, for the work that you've done. Couple ground rules. Privacy interests are paramount. I'm not going to be identifying officers or healthcare workers by department, by title. You'll hear very little about that. There's no reason for that, for the finding of fact and for these conclusions. You have already heard about some officers being injured. We will recap that at the end by department, but not identifying which department, which injury. If those officers or those individuals wish to do so at another time, they may do so. But it will not be coming from me, because that does not serve the purpose of what we are here for today. And further, Officer Andrew Duarte, his family, and speaking with his mother, who I am going to tell you right now is one of the strongest, most wonderful people I've ever met in my entire life, wants to make sure that this entire community and every officer is supported and able to heal. If anyone was hurt or harmed by anything that we are doing here today, that would denigrate the memory of her son and would be harmful to her. Our office, and I in particular, will always honor a victim's wishes and victim's rights at all times. And I'm absolutely going to do that today. Diogenes Archangel Ortiz, who I'm going to refer to as the actor. And my reason for doing so is I have, unless I'm in a court of law, speaking about the evidence in a case to convict someone, do not, or at least try to minimize any promotion of the identities of individuals that commit violence, especially mass violence. He was a 49-year-old male who resided with his significant other. In the week prior to the hostage shooting incident at UPMC Memorial Hospital, the actor's significant other was admitted to UPMC and was taken to the intensive care unit. Now, out of the respect for the privacy interests of his significant other, I am not going to go ahead and detail what her health care issues were or identify her by name. All I will do is generalize that during that week, she did not show signs of improvement. Her condition worsened, and eventually her condition became terminal. During this week, there was contact by the UPMC healthcare workers with the actor. During these interactions, the actor showed no signs that he would perpetrate an act of mass violence towards anyone or any healthcare workers. The actor did appear to be in disbelief when he first heard about the terminal nature of his significant other's condition. He initially stated he could not be there at the time that she would pass, but then he changed his mind. He remained at the hospital, came in daily, and while he was there, he was sad and solemn, but was also polite. He was described as being nice, almost too nice, by one healthcare worker in particular. At approximately 6 p.m. on February 21st, the actor did thank medical staff for taking their time with his significant other. And pursuant to the actor's wishes, hospital staff contacted him to inform him of his significant other's pending death. Numerous attempts were made to contact the actor, but he did not answer his phone. On February 22nd at 8:32 a.m., the actor did go to the West York Walmart. He's observed in surveillance video there. At the West York Walmart, the actor did purchase multiple packages of zip ties, spray paint, a knife, and lemonade. His demeanor appeared to be normal. There was nothing noted by the Uber driver regarding any change in demeanor or any aspect about him at that point. At 10:35 a.m., the actor is observed on surveillance in front of UPMC Memorial. Again, he is dropped off by an Uber. This Uber driver does not notice anything out of the ordinary or anything regarding the actor's demeanor that would cause concern. The actor at this point, he's wearing a red hat, a black jacket and pants, red and white sneakers, and he has a gray backpack. He proceeds to the second floor where the ICU is located, and at 10:37, the actor arrives at the entrance of the ICU. He uses the phone at the entrance to contact staff inside of the ICU. A healthcare worker answers the phone and asks him to hold while she speaks with a supervising doctor at that point. The supervising doctor states that he will speak to the actor, and the actor is allowed in to the ICU, the doors opening at 10:39 a.m. Upon entering the ICU, the doctor does escort the actor to an open room in the ICU to have a discussion about the actor's significant other and about her passing, and that she was moved to the morgue. The actor became nauseous, and it did appear that he was going to vomit. The actor ran into the bathroom within the room. The doctor left the room to give him space. Moments later, the actor exited that room with a firearm. He began to yell, "This is what we're going to talk about." The doctor sends a text message to staff telling them he has a gun, run. That text had a timestamp of 10:43 a.m. The actor then pointed his firearm in the direction of the doctor and discharged it twice. The doctor was only several feet away at that point. One round did graze the doctor's arm. The other pierced the front of the doctor's jacket that was hanging open, and the doctor was able to run out of the ICU. Now, this particular firearm, give me one moment. This firearm was a silver 9mm Taurus. This silver 9mm Taurus was stolen from a residence in Manor Township, Lancaster County, during 2017. The actor was a person not to possess a firearm due to a robbery that he had from the 90s. We do not know what the link is between the actor and the firearm, other than to say this was the firearm he possessed and that he used on February 22nd. After the doctor left the ICU, as he was running out of the ICU, the actor went and pulled a healthcare worker out from under a desk. This healthcare worker had taken cover, and the actor provided the healthcare worker with a bag of zip ties. The actor then instructed the healthcare worker to zip tie everyone else up. This healthcare worker did zip tie 2 other healthcare workers in the ICU. At 10:43 a.m., York County Control began to receive calls from inside the hospital, and a dispatch for units to respond began. Also, at around this time period, another healthcare worker attempted to respond to the ICU. Upon opening the doors to access the ICU area, the actor peeked around the corner and pointed his handgun at the healthcare worker. The actor then fired at her one time, causing the healthcare worker to take cover from the actor. The actor began yelling at the healthcare workers in the ICU, stating things like, "If you don't come in here, I'm going to go room by room and start shooting people." At 10:47, UPMC hospital police officers respond and arrive at the ICU. They immediately hear gunfire. These officers responded each to a different door entering into the ICU. The entrance that we're primarily going to refer to, which is the one that the actor entered into and becomes a subject when we talk later on about the shooting that occurred in the hallway. That is the main door of the ICU. There are other entrances to the ICU as well. One officer went to the main entrance and opened the doors, while the other officer went to a side entrance. That UPMC officer entered, and upon entering into the ICU, they observed that the actor had a healthcare worker held hostage with a gun to that worker's head. The actor states to the officers that he will kill the hostage should anyone enter the ICU. The actor then discharges 2 to 3 rounds at one of the UPMC officers. Based upon this occurring in the hostage situation and the firing of the handgun at one of the UPMC officers, the UPMC officers at that point retreat and wait for the other officers to arrive that are on their way for dispatch to now resolve the hostage situation that may result in imminent death to any one of the hostages. At 10:51 hours is when Officer Duarte and another officer both arrive in position outside of the main entrance doors. Other officers are also arriving and are going to different points of entry and exit around the ICU. They are also, at this point in time, they are establishing perimeters and are making determinations on how to protect the hundreds of other employees, patients, and visitors who are present at the hospital during this hostage situation. Once the officers had arrived, they did not hear any more gunfire. At this particular point in time, the officers stated to each other, if we hear any gunfire, we are going to immediately enter. Otherwise, this is a hostage situation. And with it becoming a hostage situation with no active fire, it changes from the immediacy of the active shooter situation. And the officers all began utilizing their training and experience to go ahead and work and achieve different protocols that the situation now requires. During this time period, another situation occurs. The last of the shots fired that is heard happens when the doors were open and the UPMC officers are observing what is occurring into the ICU. After the 3 shots are fired at the UPMC officer, the actor points his firearm at a healthcare worker who is laying on the ground. He proceeds then to discharge 1 round, striking the healthcare worker in the leg. That is the last round discharged, and prior to the time period when the officers take their position at 10:51. During the time period as the officers are gathering and are in position outside of the doorways and are evaluating and establishing their other positions, the actor reapproaches one of the healthcare workers and zip ties her hands before stating, "It's 11:02. Tell them they have until 11:25 or they're gonna start being bodies." The actor also had been calling for another healthcare worker who had been assisting with treatment of a significant other, and officers to enter into the ICU naked to prove they were unarmed so that he could go ahead and confront the other healthcare worker. The actor places a phone call. He calls an individual overheard as being Leo, and he tells that individual to go clean up his house and give his jewelry away. He is overheard by healthcare workers stating, "Tell everybody that I love them. This is what I want. This is how I'm going out." Law enforcement was able to confirm through call detail records that this call was made to the brother of the actor. Pennsylvania State Police did work to execute a search warrant on the 22nd on the actor's residence. They served that search warrant at 9:36 p.m. on this same day. And upon arriving, they did in fact observe the confirmation of the call as well that was made by the actor to his brother. And it was readily apparent that numerous items were removed from the actor's residence. The state police, assisted by our county detectives, ended the search warrant at 10:30 p.m. There was no information discovered within the residence that would help to provide any clarity or clarification regarding the mental state of the actor. And in fact, an investigation did occur into the mental state of the actor. Numerous interviews were conducted with individuals that knew both the actor and his significant other. There was no description provided whatsoever that would lead anyone to have believed that the actor was going to commit this type of mass violence. The most indication that had occurred regarding the actor's past and any types of mental health issues, all was from information obtained from years prior. No one had any information that tied to the recency of the events that occurred. If I may have one moment, please. The healthcare worker who was shot in the leg, that healthcare worker was instructed to go deliver a message to the police outside of the ICU doors. The healthcare worker saw this as an opportunity to be able to flee being in the presence of the actor, and did so, fleeing into the bathroom of the first patient room, and she was able to lock herself inside. As more officers began to arrive, they began to position themselves outside of the ICU door and still do not hear any additional gunfire, as this is a hostage situation. The officers at this point in time that were by the ICU entrance door, and at this moment, with information provided by a special tactical individual as part of our countywide QRT team, they open the doors and attempt to assess the situation. In opening the doors to assess the situation, they establish a plan. The plan was going to involve the first officer in, should they need to enter, and should this be a shooting situation, was going to be the officer who held a shield. And he would provide cover for the officers entering in behind, should they need to, at that moment, eliminate the actor as the shooting threat. When the doors open, the actor begins yelling, "Back the F up, close the effing door, I'm not messing around, get the F back." The actor also attempts to use a healthcare worker as a hostage and as a shield against law enforcement. Law enforcement was able to go ahead and observe a female staff member on the ground. They were also continuing to observe the healthcare worker being held at gunpoint, being held hostage, and that the healthcare worker, he kept saying that he was going to blow her head off and ordering them to close the effing door. Officers attempted to engage in de-escalation with the actor. The lead officer began stating to him, "We can work this out, man. Anything can be worked out," as they continued to repeat that in an attempt to go ahead and de-escalate and remedy the hostage situation. Given the fact that the actor was holding a hostage at gunpoint, and with what was being stated, that he was going to shoot her in the head, and with them having no clean line of sight based upon his position and the hostage's position in the hallway, the officers did the only thing that could be done at that point, which was to have the door shut and continue to engage in further tactical discussions and in further hostage scenarios. One of the aspects that occurred is the immediate transition into a barricaded gunman scenario. At the direction of supervisors and members of the quick response team for York County who were arriving, officers were divided into entry teams. Some officers on the left side of the main ICU door and some on the right side of the ICU door. All were being instructed on how and in which order to proceed, all of which would follow the officer who had the protective shield. As they were organizing at this location, they were also organizing at the other points of entry into the ICU and continued on the other floors to look after and to ensure that there's no further threat to any individual anywhere in the hospital. Part of dividing up in the team of officers was also to determine what officers would render medical aid. And they divided up to where certain officers would provide immediate medical response should that become necessary. With each officer, all from numerous departments, coming together as one to go ahead and determine how they are going to serve and protect. At approximately 11:11 a.m., a healthcare worker was able to snap out of her zip ties. The actor points his firearm at her head and pulls the trigger 3 times. The firearm at this point was empty and made a clicking sound when he was pulling the trigger. This fact as to whether or not the firearm is unloaded was unknown to the healthcare workers beyond this clicking. One healthcare worker believed that they observed the actor striking his firearm like it was jammed. No individual that was a healthcare worker was aware if the actor had any additional rounds of ammunition or happened to have another firearm. No member of law enforcement had any awareness whatsoever of what the status was of the actor's firearm, other than the fact that he used it to shoot at and to shoot multiple individuals and was continuing to threaten to kill other healthcare workers. The healthcare worker attempted to get up, but was pushed back down by the actor. The actor then decided to grab another healthcare worker who was lying on the ground with zip ties nearby and walked that healthcare worker towards the main door of the ICU. The actor told the healthcare worker to take him to where the most people are. The actor then pushed the healthcare worker into the ICU door to open it and followed closely behind the healthcare worker with one hand on her neck and the gun pointed at the back of her head. At 11:13 and 45 seconds, the actor, while holding the healthcare worker hostage at gunpoint, exited the main door of the ICU. The officers that were in their tactical positions immediately created a reactionary gap and backed up in order to take full recognition and to make full determinations of the hostage situation that was in front of them. Every officer to a person stated that they were not going to discharge their firearm unless they believed that they had a clear and present opportunity to strike the actor and not strike the hostage. Officers from both sides of the doorway begin to fire. The first officers to fire were the ones with the most direct line of vision. Those were the officers from the left side who had the direct line of vision of the hostage and were able to fire swiftly and truly at the actor. Then officers, and this is occurring in real time in a matter of half seconds to seconds, with decisions needing to be made with incredible precision, proceed to fire from the right side. One such round from a shotgun that is fired by an officer who is positioned closest to the wall on the right side strikes the actor in the back, upper shoulder area on the left side. Pellet from this shotgun shot also strikes the wall. No pellet strikes the hostage, as the shot is pulled to where it would strike the actor or nothing else next to the actor, and not the hostage. As the shot is fired, one projectile strikes the lead officer on the left side of the door, holding the shield. In his right hand, he held his firearm, his handgun. The projectile, the shot, hits his right hand and travels into his arm. At that point, Officer Andrew Duarte is diagonal and slightly behind to the officer with the shield. He is turned slightly to the left, and he is aiming at his target, being the actor, to free the hostage. Two shot strike Officer Duarte. One shot strikes him in the left arm and goes across his chest. The other strikes him at the left side chest area, at the mesh area, where his tactical protective vest would not have coverage, and strikes him at the mesh and goes across his chest. A third officer on the left side also is struck in the leg from another shot. It is unknown if this shot was a through and through, meaning has gone completely through the actor, or was one of the wounds that struck the actor and struck the officer in the leg. We do know that from the final count, there were 22, including the shotgun shell discharged cartridge. There were 22 cartridges that were found of rifles, one 9mm, and one shotgun cartridge. The actor was struck between 15 to 20 times. It's difficult to be more precise due to the nature of the injuries and which ones were passed through or were not. But conservatively, it would be 15 times. The hostage was not struck once. Again, as I stated previously, every officer stated to a person they would not discharge their firearm if they thought they were going to strike the hostage. She was not struck. At this point in time, the officer who is struck in the hand and arm and Officer Duarte, they proceed around the corner into another hallway. There's a hallway that is near where the left entrance is of the ICU. They proceed back into that hallway as well as some other officers. Officer Duarte realizes he's hit and says so. He then proceeds forward down the hallway back towards the ICU. When he gets to the corner of the ICU, to go into that hallway, he sees the officer who was struck in the leg down. That officer, at this point, is now being pulled by another officer. Officer Duarte leans over to the officer who is down and now is starting to be moved. Officer Duarte then, after leaning down towards that officer, succumbs to his injuries and collapses on the ground. I mentioned previously about how officers were responding and assigned to respond for medical care. Immediately, those officers responded to the ones who had been injured. One immediately responded to the officer who was struck in the hand and arm and began to apply tourniquets to go ahead and help stop the bleeding. Another applied 2 tourniquets to the officer who was struck in the leg. 2 officers came over with one in particular with specialized TACMED training, began to care for Officer Duarte. And they all provided as best and swift emergency care as is humanly possible. At that point, medical personnel from UPMC continued to come forward to treat them. All three officers were transported quickly and decisively to Wellspan York Hospital for emergency treatment. The actor, meanwhile, he was fatally struck multiple times, including injuries to the head, to the neck, to the torso, again, struck between 15 to 20 times. The actor dropped his firearm during the course of this. The firearm was picked up and collected by another officer. The officer who collected the firearm cleared the firearm to make sure that it no longer could be a danger or threat. That particular firearm was unloaded at that time. Again, as I stated previously, this fact was unknown to any officer and was unknown to the healthcare workers who were inside the ICU. Those healthcare workers that were inside of the ICU, again, had no way of knowing or would have no information regarding whether or not he was able to reload, grab another firearm, or if in fact he was able to unjam his gun when he was slamming his gun to see if it was jammed. The hostage was told by officers the moment they saw that she could be free to quickly run from the location of the actor who is now down. She goes to run because of her condition and because of being zip-tied, does fall and does strike her head, causing serious injury to her. She then is immediately responded to by officers to care for her and to make sure that otherwise she'll be okay until medical personnel were able to arrive. The officers, in addition to rendering medical aid, those officers also went through the ICU and cleared the ICU to make sure that there are no other actors, that there is no other harm that can happen, and to make sure that everyone present at the ICU is not harmed and is in, physically speaking, a medical condition that does not require immediate medical treatment other than those who are patients in the ICU. All in all, the amount of officers who responded to UPMC included multiple officers from the West Manchester Township Police Department, West York Police Department, York City Police Department, Northern York County Regional Police Department, our York County Sheriff's Department, Spring-Itsbury Township Police Department, Spring Garden Police Department, Pelham Township Police Department, Lower Windsor Township Police Department, York County Regional Police Department, the York College Police Department, our York County District Attorney's Office County Detectives, the Game Commission, the Pennsylvania State Police, and finally, all of the combined members of the Quick Response Team who came together to assist in the direction and the execution of remedying and stopping a deadly hostage situation. In terms of persons in the end, who were injured, regarding healthcare workers, as we had stated on February 22nd, there was a doctor who was grazed by a projectile. There was a healthcare worker who was shot in the leg, a healthcare worker who suffered significant physical trauma, including head trauma, and a healthcare worker who required medical treatment for minor trauma suffered during the course of being abducted by the actor. From officers, we had a Spring-Itsbury Township police officer who was struck, a Northern York County Regional police officer who was struck, a deputy sheriff from the Sheriff's Department who had received a shrapnel injury, and of course, we had the killing of Officer Andrew Duarte as well, who did finally pass away at York Hospital. The individuals I just discussed, all the healthcare workers, and of course, all the police officers, all those members of law enforcement, they are heroes. These heroes showed what it means to be willing to lay down your life with sacrificial love for your mission, for your cause, for all those who you serve. The officers ran in to allow all of us to be safe. Everyone is able to go home tonight and every night that is a resident, a citizen, a visitor of York County because of the sacrifice that our police officers are willing to make. You cannot make that sacrifice unless you not only love what you do, but you serve a cause and a mission that is greater than you. You cannot do this unless you are willing to give of yourself sacrificial love. They did. They were willing to. I looked at every moment of video and I saw on every person's face that willingness to walk into, to run into the path of gunfire and potential death. They were willing to lay down their lives for every single person at that hospital. We don't always think about this in those terms, because thank God, thank Jesus Christ, that this does not happen all the time, but far too frequently it does. And in this case, it did. They knew they had an objective: eliminate the threat, save the hostage. They eliminated the threat. The actor is dead. He could not harm anyone anymore. And they saved the hostages. They saved the hostage in the hallway. Not one discharged shot striking her, while eliminating the person who was showing a desire to kill her. And in the course of that, officers were harmed, and Andrew Duarte laid down his life for us. On a final personal note, I've been doing this 27 years. Seen a lot. We've all looked at a lot. We've all done a lot. There are moments that you look at in your life and you say, I'm never going to be changed again. This is one of them. You can't change. You can't go ahead and go back to who you were before you look at this. You have to be different. If we're not different with each other, and we aren't willing as public servants or just as human beings that have friends, family, live in neighborhoods, see strangers who are in need, if we cannot at least give 1 ounce of time, of dignity, of support, of love to another, then who are we? Then why are we here? I'll never forget those faces, their sacrifices. I will never forget looking at what they were willing to do for us. If they're willing to lay down their lives for us, the least we can do is sacrifice 1 ounce of time to be kind to one another. If we do that, then maybe, ultimately, all of them, and most importantly, Officer Andrew Duarte will have the true, lasting legacy that he was meant to have. His mother said to me, said to all of us, and I know said to you as reporters, it was time for the Lord to call him home. And so it was. He persevered. He fought the good fight. He finished the race. He kept the faith. And we were all better off as a society by him having been here with us for the 30 years that we were able to be with him. God bless you, Officer Andrew Duarte, and may you find your home with Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen. With that, I'm concluding my remarks. I will take some questions. If they're going to be asked to reveal any identities or anything with specificity that would invade anyone's right to privacy or to heal, you will not receive an answer from me. But I will answer in the way that I can.
And I asked, and I think all of these questions, needless to say, we asked with the context of understanding there was one bad guy here and a lot of good people, and everything that happened because of the bad guy. That said, I just want to ask you again about the moment when the gun is clicking rather than firing. Is there, even without knowing for sure that there weren't more bullets and that nothing else could have happened, looking back, is there anything reasonable that anybody could have done to change the risk versus reward calculation at that moment, that maybe that was more of an opportunity to neutralize the threat than other moments might have been?
No. You had been asking at that point healthcare workers to all of a sudden, without knowing what's occurring, to go ahead, who are already being threatened to be killed and they's already shot, to go ahead and potentially face a mass execution if their calculation is wrong. And for law enforcement, there is no way to know. And remember, the variable of the plan of what they were going to do, which included negotiators are there. They're there to try to negotiate a hostage situation. They're there to try to go ahead and do this. All of that changed because the actor decided he was going to go to where there were the most people. And the actor is the one who burst through the door. And the actor is the one that caused the variable. And the actor is the one that made everybody believe that he was going to shoot his hostage in the head. And the actor was the one who was leveraging her. There's no option. Neutralize the threat, save the hostage.
And related to that, just more broadly, is there anything that anybody could have reasonably known at any moment to have had a different outcome that going forward in terms of training, future situations, departments working together the way you've been?
So, no. This is going to be my perspective, no. Now, I will tell you, because I know so well my friends that are all behind me, my friends in law enforcement throughout this whole county, when they have incredible victories, just like we do as prosecutors and like everybody does, you still sit down and you do a tale of the tape. You go through, you look at everything to see how in everything in life you can always go ahead and look at tactics. But in looking at this and talking with everyone, our investigators, our county detectives, our chiefs of police, and reviewing and going over things, when you are hit with that moment in time, you can't do anything different. He caused what occurred. Now, one of the things as well that I looked at when you talk about multiple agencies, you have to remember as well, and this was, I can't tell you how awe-inspiring this was. Those officers arriving from different departments who may not have worked with each other before immediately all began working together as one large unit throughout a large area, throughout an entire hospital. No egos, no demands, just how do I serve and where do you want me? That was absolutely awe-inspiring. You know, I get inspired by our law enforcement every day. But when you're watching that, I can tell you right now, my profession could never do that. We have too many egos. We are not a profession that would do or ever be able to carry out what law enforcement does and what they did that day. I wish I could say something different about my profession. And I see Attorney Paskey shaking his head yes with me in the back. It's a sad truth. We wish we were more like law enforcement.
You talked about the training and all of them working well together. We learned after this, just talking to a lot of different municipalities, that a lot of departments don't have annual training for mass shooter situations or for hostage situations. Is this an opportunity for the legislature to put a priority on that, for more funding to go towards that, so the officers do get more training? And do you know the last time that the West York Borough Police Department had a hostage for mass shooting training?
I'm not going to speak to that. I don't think it's appropriate at this time to speak to things like that. That is for discussion and determination and action plans by those who are the professionals that have to execute those items. That will be law enforcement after that. Please remember, we have an officer who was killed and other officers who were injured, and every single officer that was there, and quite frankly, every single officer, they're part of a family. There is trauma to work with. They went back to work understanding what was going to have to occur the next day, but that doesn't mean that they get to set aside the healing. They need to heal. And a second thing that they need to know from me, even though I said on day one, absolutely this was 100% justified. Every officer did everything that was absolutely 100% justified and legally appropriate. The simple reality is this: until I speak today at the conclusion of the investigation, they can't do their extra work because they haven't been briefed. And I would tell you there's a lot of moving parts to this. I was not about to go ahead and allow my friends, my colleagues, the people that I admire in law enforcement, to go ahead and just hear today at a press conference how I was going to address things. I went and made sure that I communicated with departments, that I communicated with Officer Duarte's family, that I did all those things first. All of those things in the aftermath are all going to occur, and they're going to be discussed by people that I know are wonderful, trained professionals. But there was nothing that occurred that day, and I want to re-emphasize this, nothing that you could have done to go ahead and control every variable that was put forth by the actor. The actor is the one who decided to burst through the doors. The actor is the one who decided to shoot UPMC healthcare workers. Yes, you can plan, and plan again, and they were doing that day. And in real time, in seconds, they continued to do that and did it so well that the hostage is not even struck by a single bullet. But that only goes so far. The actor controlled his death. And unfortunately, he controlled the scenario at which he had to be eliminated as a threat. All other items will be discussed. These professionals behind me, I will tell you what, every one of them, I would have go ahead and walk with me and protect me anywhere at any time. I not only believe in them, I care so much for them because I see every day how much they care for all of us. Yeah, Mike, I know you.
Question about outside the ICU. How many officers are in that hallway, and how are they deployed? How many to the left, how many to the right? How were they situated? Is the doorway, I guess, parallel to the hallway, or is the doorway at the end of the hallway? Were they lining this part, or are they lining?
So I'm going to be careful.
I was confused about that.
So I'm going to be careful with how I answer, because there are some extra details that I don't want to, because I don't want to go ahead in case there's any tactical privacy aspect with it. I think the best way I can answer it is that there was a stack at both sides with determinations made as to who would enter first, in what order, and stating that, of course, the first who would enter would be the individual with the shield. The doors themselves are double doors that are kind of, if you think and know hospital doors, with how they open, how you'll have one go in and one go out. That's how these doors are set up. And with where they were closer towards the end of a hallway, towards one end of the hallway than the other. It needs to be remembered too, as I was stating, this is not the only way to enter or to leave the ICU. And so there was positioning, stationing, and there was tactical determinations made at every single door, every single one.
And Officer Duarte was immediately behind the officer with the shield on the left side.
So he was behind him.
Was he immediately behind him? Or?
So diagonally, he was not covered by the shield. They were diagonal because, again, remember, they're looking to see if they can go ahead and if they can eliminate the threat, eliminate the target. So clearly, if you are an individual who is, who has a rifle, you're not going to stand and see if you can eliminate a threat by being immediately behind an officer without that officer being out of the way, or else you will shoot the officer from behind. I do want to assert as well, that did not occur at all. No officer was struck from behind by anybody. And I want to add one more aspect to that. The behavior was so controlled and thorough by law enforcement. It truly was. This is not something, despite the variables being thrown, that anyone could ever say is the actions had lacked any certainty or clarity. There was repeated discussion between individuals, planning, there was strategizing, the commitment to different aspects that would occur at certain times. Again, he provided an absolute unknown variable by bursting through those doors.
How wide is this corridor? How close is everybody standing to the center where the hostage is and where the officers are?
I know we have an exact measurement. It's a typical hospital hallway where you're able to go ahead. Of course, you need to be able to fit hospital beds, individuals walking with them. So it's just best way I'll describe it is a standard hospital hallway. It's not, like the area where they were was not like a foyer. It wasn't like an open visitor room area. This is just a standard hospital hallway. What's that?
Guns are within feet of each other going down.
I mean, so if you're talking about individuals next to each other, yes, they're next to each other with their firearms. They are, anything is in terms of feet. It's multiple feet that they are across from each other. But it still is relatively close proximity because, again, he came through the doors in between them as to where they were going to enter. So they were all within feet of the actor, and that was most important. The proximities, of course, have to be closer. They have to be because of the positioning and the nature of where potentially they were going to enter. But it was plenty of distance to be able to accurately and successfully determine where the actor was positioned versus where the hostage was positioned, and to safely fire and eliminate the threat without striking the hostage.
Tim, how far away, I know this was just asked, so I'm trying to determine how many shots were fired leading up to Officer Duarte being mortally wounded?
Are you talking about in the ICU itself?
Yeah, and when the shot that claimed his life, who fired the shot that claimed Officer Duarte killed?
I will not say that.
Was he killed by what we would call colloquially friendly fire?
So I do not use that term because as a prosecutor, I'm not a member of law enforcement.
Kind of round struck.
And I do not use that term. And the reason why I do not use that term is because coming out of the mouths of individuals like me who are not law enforcement, it sounds trite, it sounds haphazard. And quite frankly, I don't like doing that since I'm not a member of law enforcement. What I will say is, as I said before, there was a shotgun shell that was discharged. One of the pellets from the shotgun shell struck the back from left to right of the actor. There were pellets that struck the wall. One pellet went across the doorway to the other side of the hall, struck the right hand of the officer who was holding the shield and holding his firearm, his handgun in his right hand, and two of the shots struck Officer Duarte. One in the left shoulder going across the chest, one at the mesh at the side of his chest going through, and did not strike the plated part, the protective parts of the protective vest. This all came from one discharged shot. When I'm using the term shot, remember with shotgun shot, there are multiple pellets within a shotgun shot. So this was not repeated random discharging of a shotgun. This was one discharge with a line of sight that can be seen from video at the actor that did strike the actor with pellet from the shot that also had three that traveled across to the other two officers.
Shotgun round penetrates the actor, 3 pellets not bounce off, but splinter off. Strike one of the officers with the shield and then also strikes Officer Duarte.
Yes, one shot hit the right hand into the arm of the officer holding the shield. It was the arm that he had exposed because he was holding his handgun, prepared if he had successful line of sight to go ahead and use his handgun. And 2 shots at the posed position and ready to eliminate the threat, Officer Duarte, striking him at the left.
Tim, do you believe that Ortiz did not fire at that moment, did not discharge his firearm?
He did not discharge his firearm. His firearm was not loaded at that moment.
Tim, a lot of the hostage situations and standouts that we come across are somebody behind a single door. Was this a unique situation for the officers and the tackle teams to have it in a single hallway with people on both sides? Was this a unique situation, and are there protocols to address these situations where officers are on 2 sides of the situation?
The best way that I will put it is that the officers train for all different scenarios. From what my understanding is, a door that opens in the manner of which a hospital door opens is different, requires different aspects. But the officers were highly trained and prepared to go ahead and utilize that situation. Anytime that you have multiple hostages in this scenario, they are complex situations. They are. There are tactics and there is training that has been done, and there are experts in this area that have attended and that were there at the scene and were giving guidance on what to do and on the steps to take. We have a highly, highly trained quick response team. The officers that were there, I know for a fact, not only are QRT officers, but other officers. there were many that are highly trained, highly experienced, and every officer there, regardless of who they are and what their rank was and what department they came from, immediately followed orders and immediately fell in to carry out the mission the way it needed to be, in accordance with the tactical guidance and advice that was being given by highly trained professionals. So our officers are prepared for any scenario and situation like this, regardless of the doors, regardless of whether or not there is clear visibility, regardless of or not of what all the circumstances are. They have training, they rely on their training. And again, I go back to this, in relying upon training. Even in the time of greatest instinct, they held their training and eliminated the threat and saved the hostage and did not strike her once. That is the product of repetitive training that becomes part of you. Where to move, how to slide, how to go ahead and make sure you have the clean, clear shot, and how you're proceeding in that way.
Were there any patients who were present during this hostage situation or as the situation moved to the hallway or to and from the doctor's quarters during this entire process?
The ICU did have patients. I don't want to say anything more than that out of the respect for them, their privacy, but the ICU did have patients. It was a fully functioning ICU.
So you said the officers have returned to work. What sort of mental health resources have been made available to them to help process what happened?
So I don't know how the other chiefs feel about this. My feeling is this, that those topics, there are resources available, and again, I want to thank so much our Fraternal Order of Police, and I want to thank so much Attorney Ed Paskey, working with them for all the different things, the State Fraternal Order of Police, the National Fraternal Order of Police. They have shown great care, have worked with individuals greatly, and they are there for all law enforcement. I don't want to go into the details because mental health counseling and how we utilize it and what we do with those resources is very personal and is very private. And I do not want to intrude or invade any privacy of any individual or any officer. All I want to say is that seeing their response for the care and the well-being of their officers was, again, absolutely wonderful, absolutely remarkable, and I'm so highly appreciative of all that has occurred in that regard. I'll take one more question, and then we're going to go ahead and have a wrap. And I saw your hand up first, Amy.
You mentioned he was yelling that he wanted, they had until 11:25, but there was going to be bodies. What did he ultimately want out of it? What was the goal? Did that ever get stated?
So his ultimate goal, why he took, and I know people would want to know, and we wanted to know, what was the history, what was the background, what would be the extra aspects of motive for what would occur, what ultimately is an end game. There's no documentation, no interview, no anything that we were able to find that could clearly state what that would be. The only thing that we can state is that he on his own decided to enter UPMC that day, fully prepared to take hostages and kill people.
So you don't know.
And beyond that, I cannot state in terms of what he had hoped beyond stating about the other doctor coming in. I cannot state what the purpose of, what was occurring in that aspect. I do not know.
Is that what he was waiting for, 11:25, to be this other guy?
That's what he was, during those timeframes, was when he was making those statements during those timeframes. Why he did so, quite frankly, one of the things that sometimes you have to accept, and we've done prosecutions like this, which are called no motive prosecutions. If I were trying this case, if he happened to have lived, and I'd be prosecuting him for his multiple counts of first-degree murder, well, for his first-degree murder that would have been resulted, because he would have been one that caused the murder of Officer Andrew Duarte, and his multiple attempted murders, aggravated assaults, if I would have been the one who had been prosecuting that, I would have probably have had to look at the jury and say, when you're asking why, what would drive him to do that? Why? Sometimes there is no why. Sometimes individuals just succumb to the hand and presence of evil, and they do evil deeds. Why they succumb to the evil? I don't know. I do not know. All I can tell you with absolute certainty is the actor chose to that day and unleashed a torrent of evil at UPMC and wound up directly causing the death of Officer Andrew Duarte. With that, I thank everybody for being here. I appreciate your time and attention to what has been an extremely difficult situation. And when you have the opportunity tonight, please say a prayer for all your healthcare workers, say a prayer for all your emergency responders, your 911 workers, and most importantly, say a prayer for your police officers that are out there on the street protecting you. Please say those prayers of protection. They're here for you. Be there for them.